Alright, welcome back ladies and gentlemen to the Chupacabra tutorials channel. I'm your host Larry, and today we're going to be talking about contrast in photos and Photoshop, and exploring what to do about that in your various photos. So, I was browsing around on the internet today, and I ran across this very lovely picture of, I believe, a lynx. And something I noticed, and you might notice too, is over here in the edges of the image, everything aside from like the center point of this cat here is kind of grayed out a little bit. So there's not really like a good black point in the background. So everything kind of looks like it's more muted and kind of washed out and faded. And that's usually something that can be fixed by adjusting contrast. But unfortunately, this image that I've got here, it's got a couple of other issues, and mostly it's just that there's a lot of different bright spots here that are kind of overwhelming the white balance or the color balance here for exposure. So let's just kind of experiment with that. So I'm going to hit Control J to duplicate this layer, and we're going to see what happens when we start to play around with it. This is something you kind of end up having to do with your photos a lot, especially with raw photos in Camera Raw. But sometimes it's just good to improve photos that you were given so that you can put them up on the web or use them for something, and you just want them to look their best. And when it comes to contrast, sometimes it's just a matter of developing an eye for that. So if I just bump up the contrast, something very noticeable happens. You kind of lose a lot of the mid-tone details of this cat. So if you look at its chest, when I leave it at like next to 0, you get a lot of that nice detail of its fur. You can see a lot of the patterning in it. And when I jank it up, you kind of lose the subtleties there. And it looks very washed out and very bright, like you're taking a picture at night when it's like a flash or something. So that probably means that we need to edit more than one thing here. So I'm just going to select my contrast layer and delete that. I'm going to select our copy here of our links. I'm going to go up to filter. I'm going to go up to Camera Raw filter. What this button does is it's less of a filter and it more just pulls our image into the Camera Raw editor. I almost kind of like this editor better for quickly adjusting things like brights and shadows and blacks and everything. And just for kicks, let's have a look-see here and see what happens to our links if we just let the Camera Raw system just kind of decide things for itself. And you know, that looks pretty darn good. Most of the time I don't like the automatic features of Photoshop because they tend to blow out something and it looks like crap. But in this case, this links looks pretty gosh darn good. Like I could almost just use this as is and just go if I'm in a hurry. And so this tells me a couple of things just for reference. You know, the shadows could be pumped up a little bit and the blacks brought down to give these really dark portions in the shadows some oomph to really pop. And then by reducing the whites and reducing the highlights, we kind of keep some of the detail in the fur right here. So let's return this to default and let's play with this a little bit. So most of the time I might just say, let's use contrast. Another good way to get rid of things that kind of look like white hazy fog is to use the D Haze tool down here. And I almost like this a lot. I love the D Haze tool. It does a nice job. And really what the D Haze tool is it's trying to remove fog from a picture, like actual real physical world fog. But it tends to remove things like lack of contrast because it uses contrast and a couple of other highlighting tools to remove fog from an image, which is just kind of like a gray point in the image. So maybe we'll just add a little bit of that just for kicks. You got a lot of tools that you can use inside of this program. Let's bring down the blacks so we get rid of a lot of that gray. Now we still see that we kind of lose some of the detail in the face. Like it really starts to look like you're taking a picture with like a flash or something, in my opinion. So let's go to shadows and really bring that up just a notch. Maybe see if we can, whoa, that really blew it out. Let's try to like use exposure, just knock it up just a touch. And then we can bring the blacks down just a, whoops, just a smidge more. Try and recover that. And then let's bring the whites down, the highlights down a little bit to kind of recover some of that detail in the fur. Bring up the white. And do we need to bring the whites up? Not terribly. I mean, you can just for the for contrast's sake, but that looks pretty good. And how are we doing on Vibrance? Let's jank up the Vibrance just a smidge. I find, in my experience, there's a couple of things I've always done in digital photos ever since I took a digital photo class in college, and that's I always kind of junked up the Vibrance a little bit to make things pop a little bit more for color, and then I kind of bump up the clarity just a little bit. My teacher in school always used to say you should probably like put a clarity or sharpening, that's what clarity tends to be, up a bit on all digital photos because they tend to be a little bit on the blurrier side in compared to other photos. But this one actually looks pretty sharp and crisp. Like whoever took this sharpened it pretty nicely to begin with. And that looks pretty good. Whoops, let's undo that. Let's see what happens when we put it to auto. Auto's pretty close. In fact, I like this one a little bit better than the auto because it takes more of that gray out. And this is a good example of, you can't always fix everything that looks gray by just bumping up the contrast. Sometimes you gotta take it apart and gently tweak it. So, I'd say if you were gonna do like a lot of photography like this and you find yourself having a lot of photos turn out gray, you make sure you use raw camera photos. Make sure that your camera does that. Most of them do if you got a nice one, a nice DSLR or something. And take them in RAW, and that gives you the power to make a lot of these adjustments in post without things artifacting and looking like they've got little pixels, kind of like this. Then it can be crisp and clear, and you don't lose any detail in your photo, and you're good to go. I know that looks great compared to the original. And I might even tweak this some more. Like, you could spend a good half hour tweaking some photos. Sometimes because it needs it, sometimes just for your own education. And the third thing is it tends to be like, as you learn, you kind of develop an eye for this stuff. Like, you can notice, hey, that's missing contrast. Hey, that doesn't have a white and a black point. That one needs more vibrance. That one's not very sharp. That's got a weird focal point where it's like focusing in the background. You kind of just pick up on it over time as you see enough of these photos. So that's it for this one, ladies and gentlemen. I've been your host, Larry. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out some other videos that I have on Photoshop. It would help me out a whole bunch if you'd stick around and check some of those out. And that's about it, really. I mean, I'm more than happy to answer any questions people might have in the comments below. Weigh in on, like, changes to photos sometimes. And, yeah, all that fun stuff. Leave those in the comments. I'd love to chitter-chatter with you. And until next time, bye, everybody, and have a good one.